My regards, friends. Welcome to my channel. I am Alexander Musienko. Today is Wednesday, May 14th, and here is your traditional briefing with the information I consider relevant, important, and worthy of your esteemed attention. Well, as usual, there's plenty to talk about because, once again, the top topic this week, I know maybe some of you are already tired of it. The discussions about it is the possibility of negotiations in Istanbul and everything currently revolving around and connected to this. We understand perfectly well that there are, including right now, some preparatory discussions taking place between Ukraine and the US and between Ukraine and Europe. What is this supposed to look like? Among other things, the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is actively communicating with the media. As always, he is trying to explain and convey the position, his own and that of our country, absolutely openly and transparently, so that we understand what to prepare for, what awaits us, and what our expectations are, particularly regarding what is supposed to happen soon on May 15th in Istanbul, or perhaps not happen at all. It is known that the president of Ukraine will be visiting Turkey. At the very least, he will meet with the president of Turkey, Recep Tayyip Erdogan. It is also possible that there will be other meetings because at this time there will actually be many high-ranking diplomats in Turkey, since today the summit of foreign ministers of all NATO countries is starting in Antalya. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte has already arrived there, and he has held meetings with Turkish President Erdogan and Turkey's Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan. Of course, US Secretary of State Marco Rubio will also be there. Currently, the top American diplomat who also serves as the US President's National Security Advisor is one of the most influential and powerful figures in Trump's team in terms of authority, status, and decision-making capabilities. There will also be special representatives of the US President, Keith Kellogg and Steve Witkoff. I think there will be many other diplomats as well. It is unknown whether Trump himself will come, as he is currently nearby, having traveled to Saudi Arabia. There, he had a meeting with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. Interestingly, given that the American delegation arrived, they brought along a large McDonald's trailer, a mobile McDonald's, in order to provide every possible comfort for the American delegation's stay in Saudi Arabia. You could even say it like that, actually. Well, that's also quite an interesting detail. But for now, we're not discussing these diplomatic twists and turns, because we've already talked a lot about that with you. Let's touch a bit on the front, since a publication has appeared in the reputable outlet Financial Times, which, citing unnamed Ukrainian experts and intelligence officers, reports that Russia is pulling in certain forces and preparing to continue offensive actions. As of today, there is no indication at the front that Russia is preparing to halt hostilities or to stop its offensive operations. On the contrary, everything clearly shows that they are preparing to continue their offensive actions. And you remember that I have repeatedly said on my channel that what the Russian troops are doing indicates that Putin is counting on a summer campaign, which, according to the statement of the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, President of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelenskyy, is ongoing right now, this summer campaign, despite the fact that it is not yet officially summer on the calendar, but it is underway and it is happening. And what is the goal of this campaign? In my opinion, the enemy will do everything possible to try, specifically in the summer, to advance and get, if not to capture, then to get closer to capturing and fully occupying Donetsk region within its administrative territorial borders. This is what the enemy will be focusing on. This is where their main efforts are concentrated right now. If we take a look, even in the publication by the Financial Times, it is mentioned that Russia, as of today, has deployed its forces in the Pokrovsk direction, in the area of Toretsk as well, where they are also conducting offensive operations. It is likely that they are pulling their forces here, thus narrowing the areas for their offensive, intensifying and focusing their attention specifically on the Donetsk region, redeploying their forces, including those that were previously engaged somewhat in the Kursk region or in other places, precisely to the Donetsk region, Toretsk, the Pokrovsk direction, and the Lyman direction, with the aim of conducting offensive operations specifically there. This is what the aggressor currently has planned, and it is there that they will carry out these offensive actions. Their intention for the summer is just as it is, because it must be understood that Russia also does not currently have the capability to conduct offensive operations along the entire front line. And in order for them to restore this potential, of course, they need a pause. And it's far from just a month. No, 30 days is not enough. For this, they need at least half a year, or even more. But if we had a ceasefire for such a period, then obviously for Ukraine as well, it would be an opportunity to take advantage of this pause and to say that we too would be recovering, both on our own and in particular with the help and support of our Western partners, who, let's say, would be producing weapons, purchasing them, and would be ready to invest in weapons manufacturing here. In other words, we would also be finding solutions to become stronger, to enhance our potential, and to compensate for our losses. So, whenever we talk about pauses, they can always be used by both sides. Well, essentially, that's what concerns the front line at the moment. The second objective that the enemy will pursue is strikes along the front line, possibly including feigned preparations for larger attacks in other sectors of the front, for example, in the Kharkiv region or in the Zaporizhia direction. But the main goal of these attacks is to try to exhaust the units of the Ukrainian Defense Forces. This is the purpose of the strikes. This is what is called harassing fire. The goal of all this is simply to continue exhausting the units of the armed forces of Ukraine. This is the second objective the enemy has set for itself in this summer campaign. And the third is the continuation of terrorist strikes, air attacks on the territory of Ukraine, as we saw in particular last night as well, which was no exception, because Russia launched Shaheds over Ukrainian territory. Obviously, this is yet another day when Russia has not agreed to a ceasefire, which the West had demanded from it. That is on May 12th. They launched Shaheds on the 13th as well. And now on May 14th, the enemy continues to conduct offensive actions at the front. We are approaching May 15th, hoping that something might change, that negotiations will still take place. But I think that practically none of you have any illusions that, for example, the Russian dictator Putin will personally come to Turkey. Putin will send a delegation. They are dragging it out until the end, holding on as those Chekists in the Kremlin think. They are stalling, buying time to keep up the intrigue, not revealing all their cards at once. So who will come? Who will represent Russia? But most likely, the delegation will be headed by Sergei Lavrov, Russia's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and Putin's aide on foreign affairs. Ushakov will also be there. There is preliminary information that Putin's representative Kirill Dmitriev might be present, and possibly Beseda as well. He is an FSB officer who was responsible under Putin for planning and organizing the war against Ukraine, as well as for studying social and political sentiments. By the way, he completely failed at this task because they were probably going around Putin and telling him that any moment now Russians in Ukraine would be welcomed with bread and salt, with flowers, with joy, with triumphant applause, and so on, none of which actually happened. And it turned out that the corruption schemes they were running there with Medvedchuk and other traitors to the Ukrainian people well, let's just say they had absolutely no effect. Although it's obvious that this whole Medvedchuk gang, as they say, milked their Russian handlers, pulling huge amounts of money directly from Russia, and, well, they corrupted them. Corruption is necessary too, but this actually led to the fact that there was no Kiev in 3 days, and no Russian blitzkrieg succeeded. That's regarding the composition of the delegation. By the way, interestingly, there's a video now circulating online where Roman Abramovich has been spotted in the Kremlin. He is a billionaire oligarch who, among other things, in 2022 took part in organizing negotiations between Russia and Ukraine, first in Belarus, where meetings were held, and later in Turkey, in Istanbul. It will be interesting to see whether he comes to Turkey and what role will be assigned to him. But the fact that he appeared in the Kremlin right on the eve of May 15th, I think, is also not a coincidence. That is, there is some purpose and some goal possibly intended for Abramovich to involve him in the negotiation process, to have him act as a mediator on certain issues. And now, moving directly to how this should look, well, obviously, the Supreme Commander-in-Chief, the President of Ukraine, will not meet just with anyone, neither with Ushakov, nor with Abramovich, nor with Dmitriev or Lavrov. He can only meet with Putin, who, as we have already established, there is more than a 90% chance that the Russian dictator will not show up in Turkey on May 15th. Accordingly, Ukraine is also forming a delegation. I think we will find out about its members very soon, and perhaps there won't be any changes at all. It will be the same delegation that has represented Ukraine before. This could include the head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Ukraine, Mr. Andriy Sybiha, and other representatives of the Ukrainian government, such as the Minister of Defense of Ukraine, Rustem Umerov, and others who have previously been authorized by President Zelenskyy to conduct negotiations that took place in Saudi Arabia, Paris, London, and elsewhere during these 2 intense months. Here, this also needs to be noted. Attention should be paid to this as well. Look, notice how the negotiation process is dragging on. What I mean is that in such a large-scale war as the Russian-Ukrainian one, which has been going on for a long time, unfortunately, it is impossible to make very quick decisions, especially when Russia has no real intention of actually ceasing fire. And as we have established, it intends to conduct offensive operations, has its own calculations and hopes for the summer campaign at the front. And indeed, it is not counting on a ceasefire or on constructive peace negotiations. When this is not the case, then accordingly, well, let's say the process drags on as a result. So what am I getting at? That formally negotiations were being prepared and initiated since the end of February of this year. And now we see that it's already mid-May, right? So we're already approaching the point where we'll soon be entering the summer period. But with Sraj, we're still at the stage where we're discussing things like the issue of exchanging all prisoners for all, the issue of a ceasefire, and so on. That is, this shows how much Russia has dragged out this process, even though back at the beginning of March, following the meeting in Saudi Arabia, Ukraine clearly declared that it supports the proposal of the United States of America for a complete, comprehensive, and unconditional ceasefire in the air, on land, and at sea. But Russia, Putin keeps dodging. Putin twists and turns however he can. Putin is looking for arguments as to why he shouldn't do this. He constantly hides his aggressive intentions and his desire to continue waging this aggressive neo-imperial war behind these initiatives. No, let's meet. No, let's talk. No, after all, there are still some prospects. This is exactly what Putin is trying to do with his actions. But now let's move on to what's next. What if Putin doesn't go? Russia isn't ceasing fire. They haven't stopped firing since May 12th, as the West and the entire civilized world have called for. And now, as is known after President Volodymyr Zelensky's statement, China also joined these proposals. So now the question is, if Russia doesn't go, if Russia doesn't cease fire, if Russia isn't inclined toward the constructive dialogue, what could happen next? And next, of course, Ukraine calls for sanctions, for tough, hellish sanctions and support for Ukraine. Regarding support for Ukraine, French President Emmanuel Macron, in an interview with TF1, a French TV channel, noted that France is currently unable to increase its assistance and supply of weapons to Ukraine, since, due to the continued support for our country, the reserves of the French army are almost depleted. Therefore, they cannot do anything further in this direction. In addition, Macron said that Ukraine supposedly understands that it cannot currently reclaim the occupied territories by military means, and therefore it is necessary to move forward along the path of peace negotiations, starting with a ceasefire. Here, France reaffirmed its consistent position. But, for example, the German publication Handelsblatt reports that the problem with sanctions lies not in their quantity but in their quality. And if 16 EU sanctions packages have not forced Russia to change its position, then why should the 17th work? A valid question posed by German journalists. Especially since, as reported by the Brussels bureau of this newspaper, this package will likely be even softer than was already expected. EU member states can only adopt sanctions unanimously, a circumstance that Hungarian Prime Minister Orban has repeatedly used to block such proposals. For example, a complete ban on the import of Russian oil or gas. We have reached the limit of what we can do with sanctions, noted one of the European Union diplomats. And unfortunately, there is some truth to this as well, because there have already been 16 sanction packages and a 17th is on the way. It needs to be implemented, it needs to be adopted right now. In Brussels, they are considering how to bypass the veto from Hungary and possibly Slovakia. We should not forget about Prime Minister Fico, who nevertheless went to visit Putin on May 9th. And this issue is a complicated one. And will this help? Putin has already instructed his bureaucrats, official, during one of the meetings of the Economic Council. He has already given orders that they need to prepare for the possible tightening of sanctions by the West, and that this is supposedly not so terrible for the Russian economy as Putin has started to claim. Therefore, in fact, the situation is complicated, and sanctions alone are not enough. It is still necessary to increase support for Ukraine. And regarding sanctions, of course, it should not be the European Union that leads and plays the first violin in this orchestra with its 17th package of sanctions, but rather the United States of America by implementing the idea proposed by Senator Lindsey Graham. He has been talking for a month now about a proposal registered in the Senate to introduce 500% tariffs for those countries and companies that purchase Russian oil, gas, and uranium. And if the United States of America were to do this, then Europe and other countries would, of course, follow their example and introduce stricter sanctions and restrictions against Russia, against the aggressor. And this would be the kind of example that is clearly lacking right now. Therefore, I hope that there will be a position from the US, but in many ways it will depend in particular on the reaction of President Donald Trump, who will undoubtedly say something both on the 14th and 15th of May, following the events that will take place in Turkey. Well, but now the Vatican is actively getting involved in the game. The head of the office of the President of Ukraine, Andriy Yermak, noted that Volodymyr Zelenskyy, the president of Ukraine, will attend the enthronement ceremony of the new pontiff, Leo XIV, which is precisely where the possible participation of the President of the United States, Donald Trump, and other leading world leaders is also expected. This is very good. This is important. I think that under the new Pope, Vatican diplomacy will become even more active in the search for, well, let's say, peace, in the search for solutions to end the Russian-Ukrainian war. Therefore, I think that we will soon see some interesting news. The Vatican is in the game, and moreover, Leo XIV has agreed to come to Ukraine. This was reported by the Italian newspaper La Repubblica. The sooner the better. This is an important visit. The previous Pope, Francis, unfortunately never made it to Ukraine, so we will all be glad to welcome and see the new Leo XIV. And we hope that the Vatican will play a major role, at least in humanitarian matters. The return of our illegally deported Ukrainian citizens who were taken to Russia, the return of our prisoners, our children, and in order to finally achieve a ceasefire and force Putin to do it. Judging by the situation at the front, he is not ready for this right now. He wants war, while we have to defend ourselves. We have to be strong, resilient to fight back, so that ultimately our will stands firm like a fortress, and with the support of our partners, we can still pursue our agenda and our policies. Friends, please subscribe to my channel, leave your comments, like this video, and share it with your friends. I want our community of like-minded and wonderful people to keep growing and expanding. Take care of yourselves, and glory to Ukraine.